Here it's Backstage with Geoffrey Morrissey. I am your host, Geoffrey Morrissey. We're at the ICA. It's my first time here, and I'm joined by Natalie from Weyes. Natalie, how are you tonight?
Doing fabulous.
So I understand that this will be your first night of the tour, and you're playing at a museum, which is sort of a non-traditional venue. Do you have to alter your set in any way when you play at a museum? Is there anything you do a little bit differently?
Not necessarily, but you do notice that the PA system is generally a little bit more peaceful and quiet, so it's not really the best show to like shred and get really loud. It's kind of more of a draw people in show.
Oh, nice. Do you have a coolest place that you've ever had the chance to perform, or a dream place that you would love to play that might not be the most traditional concert venue?
One of my favorite places, I mean, I love performing in churches. One of my favorite churches was in Rome, in Italy, which is like the city of churches. And the architecture there is so stunning, and that was a really special show for me because there's so much history, and the church was kind of falling apart, and it was really beautiful. I think my ultimate destination to play would be like in a national forest somewhere, like Yosemite or Yellowstone, just like kind of set up on a weird cliff in an alpine forest. That would be pretty dreamy.
That would be nice. I would buy a ticket right now.
Yeah.
And then so I think that people always have that obsession with genre, and then someone asked, what genre would you classify your music? Cathedral Confessions was your answer, and that's one of my favorite ways that anyone's music has ever been classified. So what did you mean by that, Cathedral Confessions on the...
Yeah, I guess it meant like in some ways my songs are confessionals, and like I try to be as vulnerable and as honest as possible with my lyrics, and then I also feel connected to the sonic influences of a big wafty room like a cathedral. And the cathedral was kind of modeled after the inside of your mind kind of being this kind of big wafty limitless space that you go to contemplate God, So it's like the cathedral is like a macrocosm of us in this weird way.
One of the things about your background also when you read interviews, you grew up in essentially all over the country, which is one of those things that I always find fascinating. So how do you think that the transience of sort of not being in one place for too long and getting to experience different cultures across the country has influenced the way that you create and put out music?
I think that I've always been kind of a collector, and I'm kind of collecting information and experiences to gain access to what a lot of people and what a lot of places have in common, like finding the thread that runs through everything, kind of like the binding glue of humanity, if you will, to use a lot of big words. But I feel like it's helped me have a more holistic perspective, and that helps me kind of have clarity and not get kind of drowned in my own, narrative.
And in addition to, living in different places, as a musician, you tour all over. So what do you think is sort of the common thread that you've noticed either in the places that you live or the cities that you play, the one thing that when you examine it, you kind of look back and go, that's the common denominator?
I notice that the common denominator is a lot of differences between human beings are superficial. That for the most part, biologically, we all want very similar things. And we also, I think, in terms of music scenes in different cities, most people suffer from the same kind of problems. Even if you're in a small town, even if you're in a big metropolis, people will likely blame where they are for things that are going on in their life. Like, oh, I'm just in this stupid town and that's why nothing's happening for me. Or, oh, I'm just in this big city and everybody's so cruel here and that's why nothing's happening to me. And it's really just you. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're in the big city or the small town. It's all about kind of transcending that, if that makes sense.
No,
So,
totally.
so I kind of discovered that it doesn't matter if you're in a small town or a big city, you can still have an effect on people and make a good impact on culture.
Sweet. That has to be one of the sort of benefits of touring, to kind of come to realizations like that too.
Yeah.
And then so I was reading in an interview, and this was a quote that I found through the last 3 or 4 years, that you can't make yourself exempt from suffering, no matter how smart or stealthily you try to approach life. So in your opinion, what is the relationship between suffering and music? Is that something like you can only make music when you're suffering? Is it something
No. That's a myth. I love that myth, though, because I thought it was true for a long time, but it's actually not true. Suffering is not like the zone you have to occupy as an artist. I think that suffering is kind of a reaction to, having changes occur, and whether you choose to accept those changes or not accept them, would kind of account for how much you're suffering. And suffering can teach you, if you have to go through a season of it, can teach you how to access your emotions with greater clarity, which I think is really good for art and songwriting. But I don't think that you have to be depressed to write good music at all. In fact, you can learn something from depression that would help your music, but being depressed in itself it's pretty hard to be productive and do things. So actually happiness and feeling free and feeling closer to yourself is what's really good for music.
Well, it's nice to hear that it's sort of like the whole suffering artist sort of trope be, I guess, debunked, or at least in from your experience.
I think that artists who choose to suffer in order to make sure that they stay suffering, because a part of them likes that kind of mediocrity, will say that it is why they make art or something, or they try to stay trapped in it as like a excuse, a scapegoat from like recognizing the fact that the flow of creativity might not have to do so much with like yourself, It might be something beyond us,
Yeah, no, exactly. It's almost like using suffering as a crutch, in a way. Are there any other things that when you got into music, like myths that you've been able to sort of like take a step back at, or any other things that really sort of surprised you?
It's a glorified service industry. So it's not like super glamorous, especially now, because I think you don't really make a lot of money selling records. So if you wanted to be a recording artist and just sell records, you couldn't really live off of it. Like maybe, but like not. Most artists tour and play shows. That's how they make money. And touring and playing shows is a very late night, kind of endless, like road to nowhere journey, which I find really beautiful and exciting, but most people aren't built for it. And it can get really exhausting, and you can find yourself in the situation where you're like, oh, this isn't the endless party that I thought it was going to be. It's kind of like working at a bar, and every night at a certain time you get ready, and then the crowd comes, and then it goes all night, and then you wake up and do it the next day, I mean, it's a little more exciting than working at a bar, sorry.
No. But yeah, I think it's one of those things that people forget that this is what people do for a living, and it's a cool job, but at the end of the day, it's a job as well.
Yeah.
So one of the things about your music, it's almost like you paint a picture with your songs, like a soundscape, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So is there an ideal place that you think people should be, either physically or emotionally, when listening to your record? Like a dark room, walking through the woods? Is there like a place that comes to mind where it would be the best experience?
Yeah. I mean, I love listening to music in a car on like a long, lonely drive in the night. A kind of an isolated, strange drive with not a lot of stops on a winding road. That to me sounds like the ultimate place to listen to any album, but mine I think would sound good then. Also, I think, yeah, if you're feeling vulnerable or confused or emotionally unsure of what's happening in your life, I feel like music can always be the soundtrack. It might not have the solutions, but it has at least more meaning. So you're not just kind of trapped in your own mind. You can access this meaning and emotions in art and music.
Nice. And then, so this was something that I've been trying to flesh out. So forgive me if it sounds like a little bit rough, but you're going on the tour with Father John Misty,
Mm-hmm.
which is awesome. And you guys both made really amazing records that I feel like are perceived as sort of like an external critique, but are actually really kind of a look inward, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
And also written before the election as well.
Yeah.
So what do you think it was, not necessarily because I think everyone likes to chalk it up to it was the political climate that made people reflect. So what made you look inward, I guess, at a lot of times when people are looking outward?
I think I've always been kind of more prone to looking inward ever since I was a little kid. I had this weird tendency to, just kind of feel like questioning everything and trying to get answers and not being satisfied with the answers that my parents were giving me or other people were giving me. And I think that reached like a fever pitch in my mid-20s because I wasn't really getting anywhere materially. Like I didn't really have a real place to live, or I didn't really have like a solid foundation to build upon. So I was kind of like a wanderer. And when your only home is your body, like inevitably you're going to look pretty far inward to try to figure things out. So it was kind of like a mixture of all those things.
Nice. And this will be one of my last questions from you. It's another quote from something that I heard you say a little bit earlier. And this was sort of in regards to like music becoming, I guess, I don't want to say less progressive, but it's so chaotic that people actually crave stability and that they're nostalgic for how things used to be. and that was something sort of reflected in music today.
Yeah, definitely.
Is that something that you're conscious of when you're creating as well?
Yeah, I'm very conscious of my being a nostalgic being, and also being somebody who kind of sees those trends cropping up and sees some of the real innovative new stuff kind of be so out there and so obscure that it doesn't reach a wider audience, because it's like we've kind of reached that threshold where, you know, rock and roll did start deconstructing in the late 90s and turning into noise music and becoming more atonal and strange, but it was like, I don't know if it was record companies or what it was, but we couldn't bring that into the mainstream consciousness. And so instead, I think they wanted to throw back to feel that kind of happiness, to feel that kind of warmth, because modernity is too stark and too noisy, you know?
No, totally. And then so you do a ton of these interviews, which as a journalist I appreciate. What do you wish that we asked you about more often, that you had the chance to talk about a little bit more, or asked you about less either?
I definitely don't like being asked about my name, so thank you. Thank you very much. I think if there's anything I'd like to talk about more, I really like talking about my song Generation Y. When people ask me about what I think about like cell phones and technology, that's a fun conversation. And just anything about the climate of the world and humanity versus nature, and, you know, like humans versus technology, all these things that we're kind of facing at this time, I find to be interesting subject matter. So.
Well, Generation Y I found really interesting too, because it was such a nuanced song. It wasn't technology is bad or technology. It was sort of like looking at it in a very, I don't know, intriguing way. So it almost felt like that was something that you were working with for a while.
Yeah, definitely.
That.
Well, just coming to terms with it, because if there's not two camps. It's not like there's this camp that hates the cell phones and then there's the camp that loves the cell phones. It's literally like maybe some old people don't have cell phones, but for the most part, Democrat, Republican, you know, whatever ethnicity, everybody has a phone. This is affecting everybody. It's like a universal evolutionary progression to have this like external device that we're all becoming dependent on. So it's really worth talking about.
It is. I'm looking around and I see 3 phones and an iPad right here.
I know,
and
here we are with
us.
the phones.
Well, I know that you have a show to get to. As much as I could do this all night, I'm sure your fans want to hear you play. So this will be my last question for you. Who are you listening to right now? Who has your ear?
Oh, man. I've been having a real heavy Ween phase, because I was a big Ween fan as a young girl. And I realized that when I was obsessed with Ween, there wasn't any YouTube. So recently I got on YouTube and like watched videos of them and kind of just revisited all those records and realized how influential it was on me, especially like Chocolate and Cheese and Pure Guava. Great Ween records. You should check them out.
Nice. We'll definitely listen to Ween. And if you thought that this conversation was interesting, wait until you listen to Front Row Seat to Earth. It is a fascinating, beautiful record. My guest today has been Natalie from Weyes Blood. Natalie, thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.